And just so everyone knows, this is going to be recorded and shared on the CAA website. So once again, I'm Callie Buckley from CAA, and I present Anne Ackerson and Joan Baldwin. If you could say a little bit about yourself, and then we can discuss your project that started in 2015.
Okay. Joan, you want to go first?
Sure. I'm a former museum director. I'm currently interim director of the Hotchkiss School, the Edsel Ford Memorial Library at the Hotchkiss School and its archives and special collections. And with Anne, I'm the co-author. We are the co-authors of 3 books, and we also teach leadership in the Johns Hopkins master's degree program in museum studies. So you can go in, you can do all the details.
Okay. Well, I'm Anne Ackerson. I'm a former history museum director. I'm also the former director of the Museum Association of New York and the National Council of State Archivists. And Joan and I began writing together, researching and writing together, back when I was at the Museum Association of New York. And we were doing some interesting projects there, looking at the sort of state of museums in New York State. Back in 2015, we began work on our book looking at women in the museum workplace, and not just history museums, but across the museum landscape. And that book is based on one-on-one interviews, a number of focus groups that we conducted, and 2 big surveys, a long-form survey and a short-form survey, to which hundreds of people responded. And I have to say that, now, even 5 years later, I was blown away at the time that so many respondents felt comfortable and safe enough to tell us their stories. And I to this day, as you can see, I'm kind of speechless, blown away by the stories that were told that would make you think we were back in the 1960s and 70s. And so the book came out in 2017, and in 2018 we decided it was time to kind of revisit some of the information, and that led to our survey that Callie's going to put up on the screen.
Yep,
looking at gender discrimination in the museum workplace. And this was based on a survey that we conducted, to which over 700 people responded, mostly women, but not exclusively, and mostly gender identifying women as well. And so you can see here the big takeaways, and I imagine that some of you have seen this because it's been out there since 2018. But what we found was that a majority of the respondents noted that they had been the victims of some level of gender discrimination in the museum workplace, 62%. And of those people reporting discrimination, you can see how that broke out. We wanted to know kind of what the spectrum of discrimination was. And so what we found was that 66% of respondents said that their ideas and opinions were not recognized, that they were talked over, particularly at meetings, with other people. 50% reported salary disparities, and 49% reported that they had been the victim of, or they had observed verbal or sexual harassment in the workplace. And then we just kind of asked the last question about their optimism, their level of optimism. That was in looking ahead to 2018 as opposed to 2017, to which the majority said, well, it's going to be about the same. And I think that probably was a prediction that came true. So that kind of gives you a sense of where things were in 2018. And I'll just turn it back to Joan to see if you have any particular insights that you want to share about any of this information.
We've been around this field for a long time, and I think we were both prepared. Well, the one piece that Anne didn't mention is that prior to this book on women in the museum field, we had written a book called Leadership Matters, not the version that you're seeing on the screen there, but an earlier version. And that's built around a series of 36 interviews. And during many of those interviews, some of the women we were talking with said, what the heck? When are you going to write a book about women's issues in this field? And that was sort of the poke that we needed that got us going on the women's book. And I think we, as I started to say, I think we were prepared for it to be bad. I think we were completely unprepared for it to be as sort of devastating as it was. I think now, you know, in the post-Me Too era, it's less dramatic, but when we first started doing panel discussions at national museum meetings, we would end up with a line of women to the back of the room wanting to tell their stories. And I can't speak for anyone else, but I'm not a counselor, and I felt completely out of my depth. Super compassionate and almost in tears, but it was horrid. And it was like opening a can of worms, like, oh, haha, I know it's not going to be good, but it was hugely worse than we expected. And I don't know if you remember, but we had, I think it was at an American Alliance of Museums panel, and two of our panelists unloaded with stories that they had not shared with us previously for the book that were so devastating and so horrible and laden with just everything that it just brought the room to a halt. I mean, it was really powerful and really drove our point home, but it was awful. So I don't know what that tells you, except the field is old school, hierarchical, patriarchal, and like many other workplaces in the United States. So.
Oh yeah, and that's something that needs to be underscored too. And I'm sure you all know this, and that is that I think the museum field is no worse than any other workplace across the nonprofit sector, across the for-profit sector, the academic sector. I mean, it's there, and you know, discrimination is being faced by all kinds of people for all kinds of reasons.
Well,
So,
I was always, I was very surprised with the number of young women in the arts fields. You know, having been in an art history department that had one man every few years. So yeah, I feel like, yeah, those numbers are shifting, but you know, the same with our history departments, say, the leadership doesn't always shift. So there's still a lot of these sort of ingrained issues, even though there are more and more women in the field.
right. We take our statistics from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which we have done right since we started researching and writing, and we found those statistics. One of the reasons we gravitate to those statistics is because they're updated every year, and they break out a more or less pretty cohesive museum workforce, and they break it out all different kinds of ways, but they break it out male, female, and by race. And those numbers are, we've been watching them now for a long time. And women occupy essentially half the museum workforce in this country, 51%. And it kind of just sort of bobbles back and forth there a little bit. But the point I guess I'm making is that lots and lots of people have come up to us and said, well, 50%, the place where I work, women are 70% of the workforce or 80%. This is a female dominated workforce. Well, it is and it isn't. Writ large, it is pretty evenly gendered. But then you go into specific departments and you'll find an overwhelmingly female workforce in development, in education, in HR, believe it or not, in finance. And where am I going with all of this? I guess the thing that I want to say is that just because women make up a substantial part of the museum workforce, and I would dare say this is the cultural workforce, generally speaking, doesn't mean that discrimination doesn't exist. It exists. I mean, women could be 95% of a workforce. Doesn't mean that discrimination doesn't exist. So,
yeah, I mean, it's important to remember that patriarchal thinking isn't just for men. I mean, it's something that sort of pervades our entire culture, and there are definitely women that sort of imbue these ideas and don't realize that they're sort of a part of how our culture works against women.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I think that's important to remember.
Right.
So sorry.
No, go ahead.
So what were your original goals with the questions, and did anything else come out of it that was really unexpected?
This is with the survey questions.
Mm-hmm.
Well, as I remember it, and I could be wrong, Anne, correct me, I believe we were lecturing at Baylor early in 2018, and the book was already a year old by that point, and that's the reason we kind of went back to put the dipstick down again to get the numbers that you see on that infographic. I don't think at that point, no one's ever asked us this, I don't think at that point that I was really shocked by anything we found. I mean, me personally, I'm much more taken aback when I hear a story one-to-one than somebody answering a survey. I think more, if there is a level of shock in there for me, it was, and I think we shared this with you, Callie, that there are two other researchers who followed us by a few months, Alethea Whitman and Nikhil Trivedi. I butcher her name every time I say it, but they did a really fine academic paper as opposed to our survey, and they only asked about sexual harassment in the workplace, not any other, not being talked over, not being mentored, nothing, just sexual harassment. But their numbers were almost exactly like ours, and that to me was sort of a confirmation of what we'd found, and really depressing. Really,
I think too, Joan, that they were asking people who had been the victims.
Right. They were
harassment.
People who'd observed. They were people who'd observed and been victim of. Yeah. So that was really bad.
Different.
I also have a question from someone. They said, I appreciated hearing how many women are in the museum workforce. Can you also ask how many museum directorships are held by women too? I'm not sure if you can answer that directly, but
we can sort of answer it.
Okay.
Yeah. We take some of this information from the American Alliance of Museums salary survey, the last one of which was done in 2017. And what they found in their surveying is that the smaller the budget size of an institution, the more likely a woman is director, and that the larger the budget, the more likely a man is at the helm of the institution. And I think that is a probably pretty good rule of thumb. And in terms of actual discipline of museums, well, there clearly are museum disciplines that are gendered. For example, zoos tend to have men at the helm. Military museums, transportation museums, men tend to be at the helm of those institutions. And natural history
museums. With the exception of New York City.
And that women tend to be at the helm of, no big surprise here, children's museums.
Science centers.
Science centers.
Natural history museums.
Right, right. And I think history museums, I think that's maybe more driven by budget size than anything else. There seems to be a pretty good distribution at the helm. I know I looked at state museums, and that's women are, well, the last time I looked, they were in the majority of directors of state museums, which tend to be pretty much universal, kind of generalist sort of museums. And college and university art museums, I don't know. Maybe you know, Callie. Maybe people in the audience know too.
I actually don't know, but it would be interesting to get in touch with someone from AAMD perhaps to see what kind of numbers that they have.
Well, you know, they've done the gender gap survey twice now, I think, and I think probably they found that budget size tends to drive. Well, they're looking at all different kinds of art museums. So
we actually had someone respond that said it's mostly women in academic museums.
Okay.
I would also just like to interject that all of these numbers we're throwing around, including the ones from the BLS, are pre-COVID numbers. And
Sure.
I'm pretty sure what we're going to find is that women overall, even some women in directorships, have taken a direct hit because of the virus. And we just won't know till we sit down a year from now to figure out what's happened.
Well, we already have seen, there were 2 months where there were almost no articles in scientific journals by women, which is kind of perhaps a sign of what's been happening.
And who's doing childcare and home care and emotional labor and everything else? Yes.
Exactly.
Well, and we know that the many of the layoffs, some of the furloughs, but many of the layoffs have been in frontline staff, in education departments or education contractors, you know, who come in and do some program and leave, so they're not true employees of an institution. And those are positions that are largely held by women. So there's that. But it's going to take a while, as Joan said, for it to all kind of sort of sort itself out so we can get a better picture. But I'm sure that all of you know the spreadsheet that's circulating, that's keeping track of layoffs and furloughs at various museums, self-reporting, but nonetheless,
yeah, and that's
any data point is good.
Yeah, that's a link I would like to share with this recording later so that people have access to what we're talking about. So I was also wondering, this is kind of a funny time to ask this question when there are so many important problems sort of swirling around the world. But even before COVID-19, do you feel like this topic has sort of gone by the wayside or has been abandoned by some people?
Yes, and I feel super white saying it, but I'm just going to feel that way because I realize, I mean, it's everything that's happened since George Floyd just makes me want to weep, and that I haven't been paying attention and I've been complacent and all those things. So, you know, let me just get that on the table. But I will say, and Anne will confirm that, you know, we start our book with a group of women, one of whom was kind of my mentor when I was coming up in 1970. Anne, I don't know, early 1970s at the American Association of Museums, now the American Alliance of Museums. They're at the meeting and they're this small band of women and they're asking for all the same things that we're asking for today. And so, yeah, it's just, you know, we called one of the chapters in the book Groundhog Day because, honest to God, you just, you know, it just keeps happening again and again. And I understand that there are all sorts of intersectional things going on and larger issues, but this has just been a current that has never been resolved.
Well, I think it's actually a really interesting time to explore it, and you kind of have to focus on different things at different times, but it's really part of this much larger conversation about, social hierarchies, and that is across the board. So this includes, gender equity in various different ways, but also the sorts of issues that are swirling around Black Lives Matter. So yeah, I totally see this as, this is sort of one panel among many that are all sort of working toward the same thing.
Right.
But it is absolutely necessary, to see these numbers and to see these stories.
Well, and I think, yes, you're absolutely right. And I mean, intersectionality I think is a good term for it because they do intersect and overlay each other. And yes, we've been focusing on the gender equity piece. It's in part because it's kind of a historic story to tell, but also Joan and I have felt that until women are paid equitably and are treated equitably in the workforce, that a lot of other pieces related to equity and diversity won't necessarily fall into place. Or they'll fall into place, but they'll still be disparate. And the money and the benefits and the access to promotions is a key part of women's advancement in their chosen profession, but economically, really across the boards.
Yeah, and I mean, we all, the three of us at least, make 82 cents on the dollar, but a Black woman will have to work 19 months to equal one white man's annual salary. And that's just, to me, that's just inexcusable. Like, who can defend that? It's just horrible. And you can go right down the sort of hierarchy of the sort of racial hierarchy, all the way to someone who's transgender at the end, because they make the crap of crappy. And right before them are Indigenous people. So, it's just a horrible scenario. And I don't know how anybody can defend it.
I will say, though, that, we have seen in recent years the Me Too movement, and then that was followed up by the museum Me Too movement. So certainly people are talking about issues, at least issues related to sexual harassment across all fields, really. So some of the gender inequities, they're still on the front burner for a lot of people. And I think the bottom line for Joan and for me is that what we want to see is a humane workplace. The bottom line is a humane workplace it's good for women, but it's good for everybody. And when it's good for women, it is good for everybody. So I think that we've got a long way to go, but my gosh, it seems hardly a week goes by that some revelation isn't made in the news about some institution. And whether it's Black Lives Matter or whether it's Me Too or Museum Me Too, we're in a period of heightened employee activism. And many employees have been empowered to speak out. And I don't remember this ever happening in my long career in the museum field. This is new. And I'm sure it's giving museum leaders and boards of trustees a lot of sleepless nights. But on the other hand, this power that's been found has been making change. And that's very exciting to see.
Yeah, it seems like there have been a lot of changes, especially in how people treat, say, donor relationships with museums, and that hierarchy as well. Because
yeah.
you know, the way that capitalism is sort of playing into our museums is disconcerting at best in terms of, you know, how you represent art and how people understand art.
Right, and that reminds me too, Callie, that one of the museum departments where there are a lot of women working is in development. They see a lot of sexual harassment from donors.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and
which is an aside, a little bit of an aside, but still.
Yeah, and this is a complete aside and somewhat tabloidish, but when we started doing the book, the women's book, and we started with our very first focus group, we had a young woman get up, no issues about this, no concern, no fear, no tears, and basically told us that she worked for development, and when she would go out to see a man of a certain age, her bosses would tell her how to dress. And she seemed absolutely comfortable with that. All the women in the room were like, what? Really? But it was a shocking way to begin. But yeah, it happens. And I think there's a whole double-edged sword there about nobody wants to bite the hand that's feeding them. But as you point out, the hand is sometimes not a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think across the board, we're looking at different power structures. So it's not just,
right.
It's not just, say, women versus the world, but yeah, there are a lot of things that are sort of starting to tie in, and I think a lot of people are starting to realize how tied in those things are, especially because of COVID-19, and how we've seen those inequalities sort of tear people apart.
If you didn't read Darren Walker's opinion piece in the Times, I think it was, well, I know it was last week. I don't know what day, but he's the president of the Ford Foundation, and it's got some title like, what privilege are you willing to give up? Mm-hmm. Everybody should read it, because it is about the 1% and how they're going to go forward, and how important it is for them to not only recognize their own privilege, but be able to give something up.
Sure. So I was wondering, especially since your survey and your book, have you seen any new resources for women going into the field?
Well, we have a lot of resources on the Gender Equity in Museums Movement website, which is a coalition, a loose coalition of people. Joan and I helped to found that group, and so there's that. Although it's probably about 6 months old, some of those resources, but Museopunks did a podcast earlier this year on gender and, well, Me Too in museums. And so that's worth checking out. And I mean, there's stuff coming out all the time, I think, although it's now blended together with other intersectional issues, I think, more and more all the time.
Yeah, I think, as Anne said, that Gender Equity in Museums, it's known as GEM, is its nickname, but its Facebook page, which you have to join, but it's not hard, I think is one of the best curated sites for sort of women in museums, galleries, and so on, because there's a lot of information that goes up there almost daily.
Yeah, well, I would like with this recording to also be able to share just resources that people can look at that sort of go along with this. So yeah, I'd really like to get a bigger list of things that people could sort of read and discuss, as well as just numbers that are out there.
Yeah.
I think
maybe Anne said this, but GEM also has a page of 5 things you ought to know, and then there are random subjects, like 5 things you need to know about asking for a raise, or
5 things you need to know about networking. 5 things you need to know about pursuing a leadership position.
And those are, they're just 1-pagers, you know, they're literally 5 things.
Yeah, page of tips.
So.
I was also wondering if you specifically have advice for young women that are going into the field.
Oh yeah, yes, we do. well, let me just say. Let me just say, and I bet a lot of you watching this either deal with students or young people who are considering careers in arts and cultural organizations, and I am continually surprised, and I shouldn't be, that when we talk to students, graduate students, many of them do not realize there are salary disparities the way there are, that there are all these issues that from our survey, they just don't, many of them don't seem to have that understanding that this kind of discrimination goes on in the workplace. They're not taught to negotiate their salaries or benefits. And so, we have all these women coming out of graduate school, and they're kind of like lambs to the slaughter in a way. And I think as graduate programs and teachers and mentors, so we've got to pay attention to that and give them some better life skills along those lines. So that's been really interesting. That and I guess I say young women, but young men too, certainly, and maybe other people who just haven't given it a lot of thought because they haven't had to. But so many of these stereotypes that have been hanging around for 30 years about how women are looked upon in the workplace are still alive and well in our workplaces. And it's something that I guess we don't talk so much about. And so it's news to a lot of people, it seems. So we've got some work to do, I think, in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, I think earlier I naively thought that the arts were a safer space for women and anyone who felt othered in any other way, because I thought of the arts as being more progressive generally, but that doesn't mean that the institutions and the structures around the arts, the way that they're getting money, the way that they're putting pressure on these hierarchies, you get the same outcome, which is really disconcerting. And that's, it's something that I've noticed and I've kind of had to deal with, that the arts has this sheen of being less discriminatory, but it's not necessarily true. It's just hidden in different ways.
We often talk about it as if it were theater, so that what the arts is willing to do out front for the audience is one thing, but what they do backstage and the way they treat their staff is another. And just to second everything Anne said, and I would say this for anyone, but I think, in the world of there's always a bigger fish and the ranking of privilege, it behooves women, all women, but especially women of color, to understand the issues Anne was talking about in terms of the pay gap, but also to know what you don't know, to read about the workplace, to make sure you have a mentor who's not your grandma, who thinks you do everything perfectly. And Anne can talk about this more, but to have your sort of kitchen cabinet or your posse, or who might be people who are just a little bit ahead of you like a chapter or two ahead of you in life's adventure, who don't like you enough to say, oh, Callie, you're great, it'll all be great, but who are willing to say, Callie, that was really stupid. Let me just fix that.
Some flashbacks, sure.
Right.
Because you need those people. I mean, I have 2 or 3 of them, and they're people that I can just email and say, okay, and don't even have to use punctuation. Just here's the scene. Tell me what you think. And they'll just tell me. And I wish that I had that, 30 years ago when I was starting. I didn't. I could have, but who knew? But I think that's really important right now.
Yeah, I've had a few, especially women that I've worked for, and I have gone back for, just their thoughts or advice on things that I just didn't know who else to ask about. So, I mean, yeah, you can get those things organically, but I'm also really interested in the new ways of mentoring. I know Polaris has a new mentoring system, but I'm also wondering, how much mentoring is about problem solving, professional development, and how much do you get those sort of personal or social issues? I mean, do mentors always feel the need to touch on those? And do they always come up? I mean, I think that's an important part of mentoring is understanding that person and their particular problems as well.
I guess it all depends on what you want to get out of a mentor, and and it can be a multitude of things. But I think that's something that when you're entering a mentoring relationship, you try and figure that out and get it out on the table beforehand, because clearly someone might be a great mentor for something, but maybe not for all the things that you feel you need. And you may have to have multiple mentors. And that's fine too, I think. Well, yeah. The more the merrier, I suppose, really. I also want to put in a word for sponsors. Sponsors are people within your workplace who are going to go to bat for you. They're going to be the ones, and they're higher up, and they're going to be the ones who are going to put your name in for promotion, suggest you for stretch assignments, all that kind of stuff. Make sure, that, I would say too, may also have something to say about pay and compensation generally, but they're the person inside your institution who's going to be really kind of looking out for you. And a lot of us work in really small institutions, and they're just not big enough to have that kind of bench. But for those of us who work in larger institutions, I think it's worth seeking out someone higher up who acts, yes, sort of as a mentor, but that's not their primary job. Their primary job as a sponsor is to move you up and open opportunities for you.
Yeah, I mean, I do also think that there's a big issue right now. I do know a few young folks that are just finishing their degrees in, museum studies, arts administration, things like that, and also a lot of PhDs that are coming out in things like art history, and they're not seeing, I mean, especially right now, the jobs they don't have jobs. So we're seeing a lot of people that don't have that support network that you would get, say, at a job. So I'm wondering, have you seen anything that could help those people that are sort of outside of the institutional system?
I think you need that support network regardless of whether you're employed or not. And I guess that's what I was trying to say about the kitchen cabinet. Those aren't necessarily people you work with. In fact, correct me if I'm wrong, Anne, but I think it's better if they're people who aren't in your workplace, who are kind of looking from the outside. And I think you should have those all the time, employed or not.
Right.
And kind of ditto your mentor or sponsor. I think it's nice if they're in your workplace, but I mean, I just made a connection for a young colleague of mine and Anne's, who's connected with Jem the other day, and I don't know if anything will come of it, but it took what, 5 minutes? I mean, it was nothing, but it's important for all of us at our age to keep sort of
moving people up
and pushing. Yeah.
Right. I have to say that I think one of the most valuable experiences I had was participating in a group of colleagues for, I don't know, it was about 7 years or so. All of us did consulting work. We knew one another. Some of us knew one another better than others of us in the group. But the point of getting together was to really examine our consulting careers and to get more intentional about that. And so we met regularly, face to face, sometimes all day get together. And we each completed strategic plans for our careers, and we bounced all of that stuff off of one another, and we kept in touch between face-to-face meetings. And even though that's pretty much kind of gone by the boards now after 7 years or so, we still keep in touch. And I know that I can reach out to that group if I have an issue that I just want to talk over with someone. And it's really wonderful to have that kind of network. And so I think everybody should have their group of people. As Joan said, they're not your grandmothers, they're colleagues who know you well enough to be able to respond knowingly and responsibly to you, but they may not know you so well that they can really bring that sort of critical perspective to whatever issue you're wrestling with. And that's really it's really been a wonderful experience for me.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like, having a diversity of sort of voices that can inform you is really important.
Oh yeah.
And it's also what I see with these different groups and different museums happening is, showing biases you didn't know you had, which is incredibly important to this whole process. But also collaboration in itself. I thought it was really interesting that you two worked so closely together on this. And just now you said, you have to lift other people up. I think that's an important part of escaping a little bit this society of museums that used to be much more competitive, people climbing on each other. But that sort of collaborative system, I think, is really important. And the idea of people coming together and just working collaboratively.
I want to go back to, oh, sorry, Joan.
No, I was just going to amplify that by saying, I think that there's, we're all doing this because we like this field and we support it and we think it's important. And one of the ways to do that is to help those individuals that we think are strong and creative and deserve a chance to get their moment. So why wouldn't we want to do that? Sure.
Right. To go back to something you said earlier, Callie, though, about the fact that so many people are coming out of graduate programs, still coming out of graduate programs with masters and PhDs and hoping to work in the cultural sector and so forth. And now we're in this period where the cultural sector has contracted tremendously. And it's, I don't know about you, but I think that the sector is not going to grow back up to where it was pre-COVID, at least not anytime soon. Yeah. And the sector was already oversaturated going into COVID. So COVID has allowed museums to trim their sails in terms of workforces, whether they'll be hiring back many, if any, of the people they laid off. I guess some of that's happening, but it's not going to be in the same numbers, I think. And I think it's going to be a contracted field, and there is a need, and there's going to continue to be a need to help, especially recent graduates, I think, figure out what can they make to take advantage of their degrees, but it might not be in the museum environment or the cultural institution environment quite the same. We've got to get really creative about this and entrepreneurial and all of that good stuff that we talk about all the time. But I think really we need to get serious about this, because we're going to see a migration, I believe, of people in the arts just moving to other sectors, because that's where jobs are, that's where growth is, that's where money is. And so there's going to be this kind of a brain drain. You know, the diversity piece is a huge issue. I think museums and cultural institutions have probably taken 3 steps back on diversity, any kind of a diversity initiatives that they might have had. And we know that in some cases they didn't really have much. But with this, the layoffs and so forth, that's just, I think, been a real step back. I think a lot of museums just took a sledgehammer to their staffs to get the numbers down without really thinking about, who they were laying off and what that was doing to any kind of diversity initiatives. So it's a really interesting and scary time.
Yeah, on the positive side, I do think a lot of people have become much more creative in terms of, you know, we have a lot of young people that are now, they have enough tech ability to create, you know, virtual exhibitions and things like that. So I think that there are completely different opportunities that seem to be arising from this as well. That doesn't involve, you know, being at an actual institution. But also there are a lot of groups that are sort of informing museums now, including things like Museum Hue, which, you know, really gives a lot of guidelines for diversity and things like that. So yeah, I'm kind of seeing a lot of things happening outside of institutions that are really interesting. And a lot of groups that also, you know, help to form these protests, like the one at the Whitney, that sort of thing. So I think there are a lot of really interesting groups that are growing, especially because of a lot of recent events. So I would definitely hope that young folks kind of keep their ear to the ground and keep apprised of what's going on, because there are a lot of really interesting changes happening.
And how we as potential mentors, sponsors, academic advisors, colleagues can kind of fuel that sort of thinking among younger colleagues or colleagues who just feel that they've hit the wall. I think that that's really important, that we need to help be part of that process of maybe it's creating a whole new culture of arts and cultural workers. It's exciting. The thought about it is exciting. I mean, the other thing I just wanted to say too is, and you've probably seen all of this or read about it, that at least from AAM's point of view, they're sort of estimating that about 1/3 of museums might close. Well, 1/3 of museums is 10,000 museums across the country. Hard to fathom that that many might actually close their doors. And I've been trying to think about which ones are the, you know, the most vulnerable. And I do think it's those that are sort of in the middle. You know, maybe with budgets of maybe 750,000 to 15 million, somewhere in there. I don't really know, but I think it's kind of in the middle there. The real big ones, of course, are going to survive, and the real small ones that largely fly under the radar anyway will survive. And now I've forgotten exactly where I'm going with all of that, but I think it's
yeah, changes.
I do think we have. Yeah, and I think we've got some opportunities here. That's the thing. But I know if you're faced with a job loss and maybe, you know, you've got a young family or you've got a mortgage or you've got all of that and student loans and everything, the last thing you want to hear is go get entrepreneurial.
That's true.
You know,
but
so
yeah, I think there might be some new opportunities that are sort of arising.
I think it takes a crisis to I think not only reveal the tough stuff that nobody's wanted to face, but to reveal opportunities as well.
So we've almost reached an hour. I was just wondering if anyone has any other questions.
Maybe not.
I don't think so. But I will, this will be recorded and will be put up on the RAAMP website. And I will get in touch with you too for making sure that we have a bunch of resources that people can look into. including myself, and to share with some of my ex-interns who are very interested in all of this.
Yes.
So yeah, that would be lovely.
Great.
Well, thank you for having us, Callie.
Yeah, thank
We
you.
really appreciate
thank you. It was a really
it.
wonderful conversation.
And nice to see everybody in the audience too.
Yep. Thank you.
All right. Thanks.
All
Have a
right.
good afternoon.
Okay,
Take care.
you too. Have a good weekend.